Hi again. James Orr in Sidelights on Christian Doctrine. Creation and modern science. Orr says, it will not be expected that I should enter at length here into the disputed questions as to the relation of the biblical accounts of creation to modern science, but I may at least indicate what I take to be the right point of view in these matters. There are those who profess to make light of the first chapter of Genesis. I do not. The man who makes light of the first chapter of Genesis does not very well know about what he speaks. I grant at once that it is no part of the function of biblical revelation to anticipate the discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries, to tell us beforehand, for example, what geology has brought to light regarding the age of the earth, or the precise order of its formations. When the Bible does speak of these things, or describes natural phenomena, it does so in plain, popular language, just as we ourselves do every day in speaking of the sun's rising and setting. What the Bible does is not to anticipate the discoveries of later ages, but to tell us about the relation of God to the world, and to convey those great truths of its origin and ordering which are necessary as the basis of a true religious view of the world, no matter to what stage knowledge or science may attain. When, accordingly, we look at the great ideas which the first chapter of Genesis is intended to teach, still more when we compare them with the fantastic legends found in other religions, we can have little difficulty in saying, I think, that they have their origin in that spirit of revelation which was in Israel, and in no lore source. What are these great ideas which stand in the forefront of this record in Genesis? 1. As already said, there is the great truth that there is one sole creator of the world, God. Put that over against all forms of polytheistic religion, and remember that the world was full of polytheism when this chapter was written. 2. There is the truth that the world is not eternal, but that God, in the beginning, created it. He spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast, in the words of Psalm 33, verse 9. 3. It tells us, and this is important, that the world originated not in a single creative act, but in a series of divine acts, a series ascending higher and higher, and culminating in the creation of man. 4. It tells us that man was made in God's image, and unites in himself both nature and spirit, that he is the crown of nature, but at the same time the link between nature and a higher spiritual world, between nature and God. Now take these ideas, and I think it will be granted that not one of them comes into conflict with science, that on the contrary, where the two spheres touch, they perfectly coincide and corroborate each other. But I venture to go further. I have said that it is not the function of the Genesis chapter to anticipate the discoveries of modern science. But this is not to say that it contradicts them. I do not believe that it does. There is evidence, rather, of a singular and profound agreement. Take almost any book that has been written on the relation between the first chapter on Genesis and geology, such as an old book, for example, as Hugh Miller's Testimony of the Rocks. And without entering into the details, the very fact, it seems to me, that it is possible to present the two series of things, the biblical and the geological, alongside of each other, as is done in these books, and to show so large and marvelous an amount of harmony between them, is of itself an evidence that we are in presence of something wholly unusual. Could the same be done with any other cosmogony, or the story of creation in existence? This writer in Genesis has clearly the right point of view, and so true is the insight yielded by the spirit of revelation into the ascending order of nature, that there is marvelously little in this primitive picture of creation, I take it to be one of the oldest things in the Bible, that is not in harmony with what our own most advanced science teaches. To all time, this Genesis picture will remain a wonder, not for its disagreement with science, but for its marvelous accuracy. With it in his hands, the simplest peasant is wiser than all his teachers on the great subjects on which it treats. if the teachers are those who ignore or despise its lessons. There is one question more. Does not this doctrine of creation, it may be said, come at any rate into conflict with the great reigning theory of evolution, particularly in the denial by the latter of what are now called spiritual creations? I cannot discuss that subject fully here, but a suggestion or two may be offered. I freely admit that the biblical doctrine of creation does come into conflict with such a theory of evolution as the late Dr. Darwin promulgated. But science has long come to see that Darwinism and evolution are not synonymous terms. And all down the line, leading representatives have taken up a stand against the evolution of fortuity, that the evolution that excludes design and brings in chance in nature to do the work of mind. It was not long before his death that, at the close of a scientific lecture in London, the late Lord Kelvin, the most eminent scientific man of his time, made the declaration that science did not deny creative power, but affirmed the necessity of an organizing and directive intelligence in nature. So far, in truth, from the biblical doctrine coming into conflict with the doctrine of evolution, it seems to me that it furnishes that doctrine with its necessary limits. 1. There is the initial limit of origins. No theory of evolution can get over that. However far, as we have already seen, you carry back your process, you come to a point at which you must begin. If it is a fiery gaseous cloud you start with, you have to explain your gaseous cloud. If it is atoms you start with, you have to explain your atoms. Atoms are not engendered by a process of natural selection. They are there in countless multiplicity, stamped and fixed with their unchanging characteristics, bearing on them, as Clerk Maxwell said, all the marks of manufactured articles. If you try to get behind atoms to subatoms and to electric strains in ether, it is the same thing. How came these wonderful strains to be there? The equivalents of the old atoms, only infinitely more complicated in their structure. 2. Next, there are the limits imposed by the rise of new kingdoms. Evolution has never yet explained the transition from the inorganic to the organic, that is, non-vital to vital, from the insentient to the sentient, from animal consciousness to human rationality. It is significant that it is just at such points as the original creation of matter, the introduction of animal life, and the creation of man that the old Hebrew narrator uses the word bara, which expresses the idea of true creation, the production of something new and higher by the direct act of God. For instance, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and also in verses 21 and 27. 3. There is the limit set to evolution by the law of kinds. For evolution is not, after all, a ceaseless flux. Variation is not absolutely indefinite. Its limits are soon reached, and there is a constant tendency to revert to type. There are terminal points along the different lines beyond which evolution cannot go. The Bible affords the necessary check to error here by its insistence on the creation and propagation of kinds, again in Genesis 1 verses 11, 12, 21, and 24. With due recognition of the determinative activity of God in the rise of new kingdoms or orders of existence and the production of new types or kinds, there is nothing in evolution that need conflict with a doctrine of creation, provided the cooperation of secondary causes is not excluded. Now, of course, these few pages will not please what conservatives we tend to call fundamentalists. They make no peace at all with evolution, so Orr will have gone over the line already, but nevertheless he represents, I would say, the Catholic consensus of scholarship, not just in his own day, but up till today, and perhaps even among conservatives. This has far more credibility, his explanations here, than it once did, certainly did in his day, because he was not called a fundamentalist, but today he would be considered to be very conservative in this view. So I'm putting a link into something I had to deal with myself when I left the Watchtower, that although I had underestimated the unity of Christians in fundamental doctrines, When I became a Christian, I realized Christians were united in the fundamentals, that is, the creedal teachings. But they were certainly not united on things like evolution. So I put together a list of teachers for the people we were ministering to back in the 1990s. I'd have to expand it a lot now, but there's over 100 of them on this list. And it's featured in this video that I'm putting on screen now called How I Landed Softly After Leaving the Watchtower. So check it out, and if you want the list, we can send it to you in PDF form. Next time, the providence of God.